Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session in America's Founding Up Close and Personal. We have with us today Greg Seibert from the Christian Citizens Institute, Larry Schweiker from the Wild World of History, John Diamond from America Unhinged, and Ralph Reed from the Faith and Freedom Coalition down in Atlanta, Georgia. So welcome, everyone. And this will be a discussion today about, you learned about the Constitution through these gentlemen, and now we want to know, is our Constitution as it was written being shredded today by the government? And what can we do as a citizenry to make sure the Constitution stays the law of the land? So if we could start with Ralph. Ralph, your thoughts on this, please.
Well, John, thanks so much for having me. It's been a great honor to be a part of this very vital program. I think it is so critical for our people, particularly young people who I don't think are getting a quality understanding, but really all Americans to understand the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the rights that it grants, and the fact that our government was established for the sole purpose of protecting those rights. And I'm very concerned at the way the courts, the government, really going back to the late 19th century, but certainly in the jurisprudence surrounding the New Deal cases of the 1930s and 1940s, really drifted from a strict understanding of the limits of federal power. The court really granted the federal government, under its interstate commerce powers in the New Deal cases, almost unlimited ability to regulate not only our economy, but every area of our lives. And then we saw, in the school prayer cases, in the 60s, Roe v. Wade, and their progeny in those social and cultural issues, how that philosophy of interpreting almost unlimited federal power led to the denial of our constitutional rights under the First Amendment, and I believe under the 14th Amendment. So it's been a real problem. Now, we're meeting at a time when we're speculating about a potential Supreme Court decision in a case arriving out of Mississippi involving an abortion law that may represent the beginning of things returning back to how the founders intended. But I think we have to wait and see. We don't know as we meet today, John, to discuss this, what the court is actually going to rule, or what the future of either that case law or others will be. But I think it's a serious problem, and it's one of the reasons why tens of millions of Americans have been motivated to turn out to vote in the last 30 or 40 years to get conservatives and people who believe in interpreting the Constitution and not legislating from the bench, and appointed to the federal judiciary at every level.
Larry, how about you? What's your thoughts?
Well, I echo, of course, a lot what Ralph said. As a historian, though, looking at long sweeps, I do think we're on the verge of a major shift. The flag case the other day, I do think that the Alito ruling on abortion is going to stand. I have a source on the courts who's yet to be wrong, and he expects very good rulings on guns and on affirmative action here in the next 12 months. It's interesting that when, my latest book, Dragon Slayers, is about the swamp and the administrative state, which is really one of the biggest issues we have facing the Constitution today, because it's apart from the Constitution. Congress created these agencies that were supposed to be overseen by the executive, but since the New Deal, executives have washed their hands of that, and then it fell to the courts. Well, the courts have tended to look at the administrative state and any agency and say, well, Congress created you, you can define your own parameters, which is insane that that's really the direction they took. And I am told by insiders that the key test for Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett was not social issues. It was the Chevron case and how do they plan to attack the administrative state. And with the exception of the one military vax rule, the rulings have been pretty good so far in terms of winnowing down the administrative state. And it went unnoticed in the Obamacare decision by Roberts, which was horrible. But what people missed was that he did rule against the Commerce Clause in employing a number of federal powers. And nobody noticed that because they were all, the left was all celebrating the Obamacare decision. But he did put a major impediment on using the Commerce Clause toward expanding the state. So between what these current justices appear to be saying, and if we can get another term out of Donald Trump, we might have a legitimate shot at really overturning a great deal of this.
Craig, your thoughts?
Yeah, so segueing what these two gentlemen have said already, the common agreement we have in all this is that our founding documents truly are timeless, because at their core, they deal with the nature of man. And the nature of man does not change. What the founders believe, that men were created in the image of God, that they were given God-given rights, and yet men that were granted power can be flawed and can consume themselves with acquiring more and more power. Both Ralph and Larry have kind of described situations where that has taken place in our last century. I also think that we're seeing an awakening to the fact that our federal government is completely lost touch and out of control with everyday people. We know prior to the early 1900s that really the federal government's interaction with individuals directly never occurred. The federal government's design was to interact with states, but not with individuals directly. The federal income tax changed that in the early 1910s, 1913, 1917. And now, serendipitously, we've been through this period of pandemic. The federal government has exerted more and greater power over us in ways that we couldn't have anticipated. But the silver lining in all of that is suddenly and unexpectedly to those in federal power, parents saw their children and what those children were being educated in their local schools. And we're in a time period where there is a true parents' uprising over what's going on in their local schools and what their children are being taught. And more evidence every day comes about that a lot of the money for COVID and other federal relief programs were hiddenly shoved into school systems to promote very divisive ideologies, whether it's ideologies that deal with gender confusion or ideologies that deal with race confusion, or not race confusion, but racism, creating separation between the races that we have not had to deal with for 50 years. So I see at a local level a real renewing going on. And to kind of summarize, the original documents still work because of the timelessness of the principles there, and the nature of man never changes. We see a federal government and a federal bureaucracy that's out of control. We see people wanting their local rights and an ability to govern themselves being reasserted. And we particularly see this in the parents' movement and the school board movements that are going on, where parents are saying, that's all we can stand. We can't stand anymore. These children that we're raising as families are the future citizens of the United States. They are not the government's property. And so I'm encouraged by the renewal movement that we see coming out of the parents and out of some of our local governments.
Mr. Diamond, John, how do you view this?
Yeah, no, I love what he just said. And I'll just piggyback off of that, because for me, I graduated in 1983, and I took a 12th grade government class, and I was not required to study anything about government. I went in the Air Force for 8 years, took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, had never read it. Nobody had required me to. So when I got out of the Air Force, I started to study theology, And I actually graduated with my degree in theology before I ever read of the founders' documents. And then me and Dr. Alan Keyes and some others went down with Judge Roy Moore there in 2003 to support him and the 10 Commandments monument. And when I came back, I embarked on really just a 3-year research project. I didn't have any intentions of doing anything with it, just for my own peace of mind. But I went back and I read everything I could get my hands on: Declaration, Constitution, Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers, Journal of the Constitutional Convention. And I just looked at this and I'm like, how in the world did we get from there to here? Where the federal government basically had no power to now where they have all power. And that's how my first book was written in 2006, called Fighting the Next American Revolution, because I realized we're going through the same cycle that the founding fathers went through when their Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights that had been written 100 years before, the king was shredding it, Parliament was shredding it, the judges were shredding it. So our founding fathers basically just drew a line in the sand, and that's what led to the Revolutionary War. So I'm also encouraged, because now there is also a renewal to understand what an American constitutional republic is, and not just from a legal standpoint, but with what Ralph does and has been doing for years with that Christian worldview. So I had Paul Blair on my show this morning talking about the Black Robe Regiment and the Great Awakening and how all that influenced, the founding of this nation. So I'm very, very encouraged. We're getting ready to do a textbook called the Isaiah 33:22 Project that puts all of this stuff together. And that's what we need to do. The people and the parents now understand that our education system is broke. I don't even call it a public school system anymore. It's a government school system. And now that we've got so many people out from under that propaganda, now we can start instructing them on what a real constitutional republic looks like.
Well, one of the things I learned from this research on the Constitution is that the Hamiltonians, James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, and some others, really had the idea in the Virginia plan that they would like to see both the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary all be able to present bills to Congress. And they sort of work towards that. And today, by the judiciary is creating law. And that's what they did with Roe versus Wade. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives them that permission to do that. They can say a law is unconstitutional, but they can't say, oh, here's what you do to fix it. That's the Congress. But that's what's happened. And so I see a deterioration in the government's and the Congress' willingness to take back their rights under the Constitution. And that's what we need to see have done. Ralph, you've certainly been doing a lot with your organization and getting out the vote and getting people involved. What can people do to help preserve the Constitution or stand up for our laws under the Constitution?
Well, I think, the first and most important is to get informed and educated. The Bible says my people perish for lack of knowledge. When you go back and you read the Old Testament and read it various times in the history of the ancient Israelites, where someone found the scrolls or the parchments of the law, and people were just astonished at the various facts about God's unique relationship with the Jews and the Israelites that they had completely neglected and didn't know because of their ignorance. And what a difference it made in the revival and reformation and restoration of a nation to have that knowledge and to put it into effect. So, John, I really commend you for what you're doing through this series, because I do think that that's the beginning of the whole thing. I think if people don't know the facts about the Constitution, which is the longest surviving written charter of government in the history of the human race, it is the most imitated, it is the most emulated. John Adams called those gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 a collection of demigods, and I don't think he was far off the mark. It was one of the most remarkable collection of geniuses that Western civilization has ever seen, and it was at a unique moment in time. where they could begin the world over again, where they could take the failures of the mother country, the ways in which England and the United Kingdom had failed, and they could apply those lessons with what they had learned from those failures. And that charter, along with the Bill of Rights, which people forget was an afterthought. I mean, it's hard to believe that the Bill of Rights was not part of the original document. It really only came about as a compromise in order to win the ratification of Virginia. Without the Bill of Rights, the Constitution never becomes the law of the land. And it lays out that we have certain inalienable, inherent rights that are part of our very humanity, that they are given by God and that government cannot violate them. If you don't know these things, then you can't really be an effective citizen. And I think, John, once armed with that information, I think it's absolutely critical that folks go out there and get involved in campaigns. I encourage people who are wanting to make a difference, go volunteer on a campaign. You know, don't try and get a staff job. You know, don't try to do more than help someone, make calls, go door to door, send text messages, register people to vote, and get involved in the nuts and bolts of citizenry to get people elected who understand these truths, who will defend them, who will work to advance them. And then as we elect more and more of those people, John, and it's taken decades, over time, in a marathon, not a sprint. You know, we all want to see things solved overnight. We live in a microwave society where we just want to put the meal in the oven and zap it for 2 minutes and everything's fixed. That's not the way things happen in God's kingdom. It's, by the way, not how they happen in free and healthy societies. It takes decades to steer a ship of state in a different direction. But over those decades, we've now had enough judges appointed at every level of the judiciary, both state and federal, that we are living in one of the most exciting times that we have ever lived in as conservatives, as Christians, and as constitutionalists. And I really want to underscore what Larry shared earlier about Chevron deference and the Chevron decision. Nobody really foresaw this at the time. Nobody understood at the time that the Chevron case was decided. They were simply trying to avoid the courts getting bogged down with all these administrative disputes. But the result of that ruling is that unelected bureaucrats throughout the administrative state have been able to make law and usurp the power of the legislative branch of government. That was something our founders never saw coming. It should not be allowed. So we're on the precipice, we're on the threshold, but make no mistake about it, John, there's going to be enormous pushback. There's going to be a backlash from the left and the media, unlike we've ever seen. So we can't let our foot off the gas now. We've got to redouble our efforts because now the battle is really going to be joined when it comes to constitutionalism, limited government, and the protection of our God-given rights.
Ralph, I think you're so right in that most people don't know about the Carbonari, which was an Italian beginning of a Freemasonry in Italy, and they formed the lodges, and one of the biggest lodges was Alta Vendiri, and they wrote a document that said this: the Pope will never come to the secret societies. So the secret societies must go to the church to capture the church and then capture the Pope. Our mission will not be a month or a day or a week or a year. Could be a century. The soldier will die, but the mission goes on. That's how dedicated they are to changing our world. So you're right. Just because we win here or there doesn't mean we surrender and start giving up. It means we even go that harder to make sure we're preserving liberty in our Constitution. Larry, your thoughts. What can the people do?
Well, let me just go back to what Ralph said. And we all agree that the Constitution and the Declaration are incredible documents. But, you know, at the University of Dayton, my next door office mate was from Cameroon. And I said, could I see your Constitution? And so I got a copy of the Cameroonian Constitution. And lo and behold, it was pretty much like our own. And he was constantly railing about their president, who was basically a dictator. And I said, do you know what the difference is? We have two documents that are essentially the same, yet you have a dictator, and in theory, we do not. and the difference is it goes way back before the documents themselves to the founding of the country by forces that no other country in the world had at the time, has had since, or we've ever seen in human history. And the two most important of those four forces were that we were started by a Christian, mostly Protestant religious tradition. And the significance of that is that it was ground up, bottom up church governance, that the pilgrims who came here believed in bottom up church governance. And that was supported by the second one I call pillar of American exceptionalism, which was common law, which we got from England, which they got from the Germans. And this was bottom up, that God puts the law in the hearts of the people, and the people elect or select rulers who will carry out or enforce that law. No other nation, not even the Dutch, had this from their origins. Every other was top-down religious and top-down government. So that's why we have a constitution that works, where Cameroon can have the almost exact same constitution, yet it doesn't work. You have to start with foundations, and the foundations were laid long before the written word. The written word was the embodiment of those fantastic foundations. Now it's interesting when we look at the bureaucratic state, the administrative state, and the whole business about lockdowns and everything else during the China virus was really because Trump deferred to federalism. Mike Pence asked him, I think this would be a good time to employ federalism here and turn it over to the states. And it sounded good, except what that meant was that since no state had a medical official anywhere near the level of CDC or NIH, they turned around and referred it back to Dr. Fauci and to the federal government. And so my point is that even with such things as federalism, even with such well-intentioned ideas, the rot is so deep that in many cases, it's like if any of you have ever worked on a race car, right? You can't just put in a souped up engine because it'll blow out the rear end. You can't just build up the rear end because you need other parts of the car to function correctly to absorb the power. And it's the same thing in trying to fix this. Our job is that we can't just fix the courts. We got to fix the courts. Well, we can't just fix the courts. We have to fix simultaneously almost every level of the American experience, because almost every level is broken to one degree or another. And so it's going to be, as you all said, a very long process.
Greg?
Yeah. So two ideas that have been served up that I think we need to communicate to ourselves and others. At the end of the day, it's really a battle of ideas. The scriptures tell us that the weapons of our warfare are not of flesh, but of divine power to destroy strongholds, and that we're called to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And so I think to your very specific question, John, what can people do? The first thing is to find their own internal courage. And that is when they hear false ideas propagated by the media, by family members, by leaders in their church, we cannot let false ideas rest. We have got to find our voice and an internal courage mechanism to say, you know what, that's a false idea. And we have to at least study and know a little bit enough ourselves and what we believe, so that as the Holy Spirit gives us an opportunity to speak, we don't sit silently, but we speak out against the false ideas. Let me give you an example. When people say American is a rotten country, it was founded on slavery, we cannot let that lie rest.
Right.
Oh, and we cannot just take part of that lie and say, hey, we want to have a gentle conversation, maybe have a point. It's the whole dialectic narrative that if you destroy the original thesis or truth with a half truth, you're going to lose the argument. So we've got to be courageous and find our voice, be winsome when we can, but speak the truth in love. The second thing that both Larry and Ralph have identified is this is a long haul. For ourselves and for our family members and friends, we cannot think that the next election is going to be one where all of a sudden we have a peaceful country. It's the exact opposite. We are entering a time period where I think we'll see renewal and awakening, but the forces that have had this power for the last 50, 60, or 100 years are not going to let this power go easily. And there's going to be resistance and threats of violence and all kinds of things. So anybody that's expecting to vote for a candidate or a platform and say, oh, if we just get this next election under our belt, we'll have peace and then we'll reach across the aisle and compromise. That's not the case, because we are in a war of ideas and we need to battle those ideas. The last thing I'll maybe supply for the group conversation is, again, back to the local level. I'm really enthusiastic about precinct level work. And this ties a little bit in what Ralph was saying as far as candidate involvement. Candidate involvement's a great path. Another awesome path is find out where you live, what your neighborhood is, and how you can get involved at a precinct level and become a chairman in your precinct. What that means is you probably have a geographic footprint of maybe 3,000 voters. That precinct might be made up of 8 or 10 or 12 neighborhoods. And if you get involved in precinct work, what you in essence are doing is saying, I'm going to take domain, I'm going to take oversight of my precinct, and I'm going to get to know my neighbors. I'm going to have conversations with my neighbors, and I'm going to get like-minded people re-engaged in civil government that may not have been engaged before. And it's a wonderful experience of really getting to know your neighbors well, but also getting your neighbors well in the process of saying, you know, we want better government for all of us. And the most first and best expression of that is taking and asserting the biblical values that you hold to your local town council and at your city level, because those are the farm teams that eventually civic leaders will come out of and occupy state level and then eventually federal level. So again, I'm really encouraged by this tactical localism of owning your precincts and owning your neighborhoods and getting involved at that level.
John?
Yeah, that's exactly what my message has been. We're trying to fix everything from the top down up or top down, and then rather than the bottom up. And it's going to have to be a grassroots bottom up populist uprising in order to do this. I'm running for, and I don't know how this will be dated once people see it, but I'm running for House of Representatives here in Pennsylvania in the 4th legislative district. And I've been using my campaign as really just an educational outreach to teach people what a constitutional republic looks like, because we've been lied to from the government. Even the churches really don't understand a lot of this stuff and are just, bowing down to what the government said. But it really was my studies on all of this and all the founding documents that I really kind of cemented it in my own mind of what type of nation we were supposed to be. And when I was doing the research for my book, I just looked up the word Constitution in Webster's 1828 dictionary. And, it says a system of fundamental principles for the government of rational and social beings. So, I kind of understood that. But then it says this: the New Testament is the moral constitution of modern society. So if we understood the Constitution, whether it's the Constitution of PA or the federal, that was just to kind of put a fence around government and say, here's what you can and cannot do. That was never intended to be the moral underpinning of society. And as a society, we are the ones who are supposed to love our neighbors, who live according to God's law. Because I saw an ad and I've never seen the movie, but there's a movie out there called The Purge. And apparently this movie is about, 24 hours for one day a year. They just allow all rape and murder and arson and anything you want to do, and it's not punishable. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I said, you know what? If every person in this nation was a Christian, the purge would pass on like any other day. Nobody would know it, because if we're governed by the New Testament as our moral constitution, we're not going to rape, kill, pillage, burn anything. But I think we have to understand that that's exactly what the communists understood. Because when you study what the communists said, they said America is like a healthy body, and her resistance is threefold: her spiritual life, her morality, and her patriotism. If we can destroy these three things, America will fall from within. Well, that's exactly what they did with separation of church and state, that illegal, unconstitutional separation of church and state. They basically destroyed our spiritual life. And then when that happened, the morality fell, the sexual revolution, and then homosexuality, and people are having abortions because they're having babies because they don't want them. And the only thing that really was saving us to this point is patriotism. And I think that's what President Trump revised, is that America first, love for the nation. I honestly think that is the only strand that saved us up to this point. But knowing that, now we need to restore those other two, our spiritual life and our morality. And when we do that, we'll have that threefold cord that cannot be broken.
One of the things that we've been fortunate to do here at Faith and Freedom Coalition Mid-Atlantic is we've been able to connect with a group called Unconstrained Analytics, which is a group that is made up of former national security and intelligence officers in the Trump administration who got fired over writing this thing called the memo. Rich Higgins was the one who designed the memo and wrote it. And one of the things they said is that what's happened to our society is the communists have formed what they call a mass line movement. And a mass line movement is designed to replace one society with an alternative society. So they come in and they do come in a defensive position, because here's our regular government and they're here, and they try to make it to a stalemate movement so they can then move above and collapse society as you see it in liberty. And one of the things they do is what they call dialectics, where all you were talking about, including Ralph and Larry and John and Craig are talking about, is that they start bringing out new phrases and new words to get us to use their phrases and words. So we're no longer arguing from our moral position, what we believe to be true. We're arguing from their terms at their lower position, and that position then gets credibility to reach the stalemate. So one of the things we have to do is accept the terms of what our founders brought to us and accept the terms of the church. The number one thing for me is, if you want to get involved, is that you have to get your church back into the public square. People need to know that the church is still there, that the true church of Jesus Christ is still there, ready to fight and stand beside you to preserve our nation and defend liberty. And that is the secret here. And that's why they call it the Serve God, Defend Liberty movement. So all of these people's sites, I encourage you to go to all those on this call today and this last lesson. Go to their websites. They're in their individual lessons. We put it on there to drive to that, because these are the leaders. These four gentlemen here are the leaders that will help move our nation back to where it should be. So, gentlemen, with that, are there any final thoughts from anyone?
I would just stress the importance of alternative media. That's why we started Brighteon.tv, because it's uncensored. And there's just a lot of God-fearing patriots, not only that talk about constitutional things, but even like medical freedom. We got a lot of doctors on there. It's going to be very important because we have a government narrative, a school narrative, a Hollywood narrative, a media narrative. They've captured all of these institutions, and we're going to have to find a way to get that message back out. So not only just the individual organizations, but the use of media, and to become the new mainstream media, I think, is going to be the key.
John, I think Craig mentioned this. It's not. We of course we have to stand up and speak out, but I find so many on our side. I call them McClellans. If you're familiar with George B. McClellan in the Civil War, he always outnumbered his enemy, always outgunned his enemy, usually had even better strategic position than his enemy, and he was always saying, "We're outnumbered. I need more troops." And we have so many of these people, no matter what the news that comes out, it's, oh, they're going to steal the election. Oh, they're going to do this. Or I don't pay attention to what the left says or does. I mean, yeah, you got to know what they're doing. But when I get up, I don't say, what's the devil going to do to me today? I get up and say, what am I going to do to the devil today? How am I going to get after these people today? So the first thing they think is, he's up again, get out of here. That's how I want them to react to us when we get up every single day, when anything passes, when a new bill passes. Oh my gosh, they're on the march. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, just in terms of final comments, John, I would just put an exclamation point on something Craig said about the precinct. A precinct is really nothing more than a political subdivision that is a term that reflects your neighborhood. It's where you live, it's your neighbors, it's where you live, work, and play. It's the people you associate with. And what we know from political sociologists is, and we see this, by the way, reflected in election performance, is that most of these precincts, most of these neighborhoods, once they reach a point of a tipping point within that area where people share many of the same values, they share the same basic outlook, people tend to conform. It's just a reality of sociology. They want to fit in, they want to be a part of something. And so generally, if you go out there and you do your job and you organize and you mobilize, you can get a precinct that's winnable or a neighborhood that's winnable, and you can get it to 60% very quickly, and then it's very hard to turn back. But you have to do it the same way that the disciples did in sharing the gospel. You can't stay in some cloistered ivory tower. You have to get out there into the backwaters like they did in Galilee and in the further reaches of the Roman Empire. They went out there and they got into the neighborhoods and they touched people that a lot of people were neglecting. And if we will do that, and by the way, this includes minority communities, areas that we've neglected, communities of color, people who felt marginalized, people who felt left behind, people who felt like we didn't care about them or believe in them. My organization, Faith and Freedom, John, you know this, we've launched major initiatives in the African American and the Hispanic communities. We're going into hundreds and thousands of African American and Hispanic churches with voter registration material, with voter education material, not trying to get them to join a particular political party, but to align their citizenship and their civic engagement with their biblical and moral beliefs. I really believe that if we'll do this, if we'll go out there and go door to door and get to know our neighbors better, and then go into areas where we haven't always felt welcome and where they haven't always felt welcome by us, that we can really transform our society. And it has to be done person to person, face to face, neighbor to neighbor, within the neighborhood. If we'll do that, then yes, it's true. It takes decades. It doesn't happen overnight. But let me tell you what else is true. It can happen in the blink of an eye. Something that no one thought was possible, something that no one believed they would see in their lifetimes, can happen with astonishing speed. And if you look if you go back and you read Ronald Reagan's 3 critical speeches during his early presidency on the Cold War and the struggle against communism, his address to the National Association of Evangelicals, his address to the British Parliament, and his address to students at the University of Moscow, you will see him proclaim the truth of freedom and capitalism over communism, and you will see him declare as the objective the leaving communism on the ash heap of history and leaving it as a footnote of history, and that we and freedom would prevail. And it happened so fast. The Berlin Wall crumbling, the Soviet Union disintegrating, simply because of the moral power of those ideas and the courage and the conviction to stand up for them and to put policies behind them. So I'm very optimistic right now. And I think this feeds into what you're doing, John, with this series, that if we will do the same thing when it comes to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we can see our nation restored morally, spiritually, and constitutionally far faster than any of us thought was possible.
Craig, it leaves you with the last word, my friend.
Actually, Ralph, I so much agree with what you're saying, and my last word, I think, will fit to summarize your remarks. Some time ago, there was a book written From Good to Great that tried to identify what made excellent businesses versus the also-rans or average businesses. And I always wondered, could those principles be used to identify countries that could be great versus also-ran countries? And the premise of that book was the big idea was you preserve the core, but stimulate progress. Preserve the core, but stimulate progress. So I thought, gosh, we've got the founding fathers, the founding documents, we've got all these great things, but what is the core? What is the core? And so I kept circulating around and pondering that. And I think you'll agree with me that as you do that over time, what you come back to is the core principle in the Declaration of Independence, the Creator. The Creator is central to everything. He oversees governments. He's designed the purpose of government. He's given us our human rights. And so it left me with a final question. You know, as a country, are we for the Creator or are we at war with the Creator? Are we for the Creator or are we at war with the Creator? And that's an individual question too, and it's evangelical. When we ask that question of ourselves, we have got to ask that question, are we living our lives for the Creator, or are we living our lives at war with the Creator? We as individuals need to see other individuals reclaim for God's kingdom and be for the Creator and in His kingdom. And that same true of our country too. We need to move from a position of being at war with our Creator and for the Creator that gave us these God-ordained rights.
Well, thank you all for being here today and for this course, and understand that yes, this world was created by God, but this nation, the true ownership of this nation are the people of the United States in a Christian setting. That's how it's set up so that the people would be moral and upright citizens. So it's our nation to win, keep, or lose, and it's up to all of us to do our part to preserve it. Go to all these websites, and you, like I said, each one of their lessons, you'll find their websites. If you want more information about what to do and how to do it, these four gentlemen's websites can do that. So with that, we want to thank you all for participating, these fine speakers in all these lessons. And we'd like to thank all of you out there who are watching these courses. And God bless you, and God bless America.